There are days when something small is enough to disturb your peace. A careless comment, a strange look, or a moment of disrespect, and suddenly your mind begins to circle around it. You do not react right away, but it stays there, repeating itself, growing louder, quietly, taking over your inner calm. I remember a time when a single sentence followed me the entire day. It was not harsh, not even deeply offensive, yet it stayed with me long after the person who said it had already forgotten. I replayed it, analyzed it, and even imagined better responses. And without realizing it, I gave that moment control over my emotions. Then one day, I faced a difficult truth. It was not the world disturbing my peace. It was my judgment of it that created the disturbance. And if that is true, then it also means I have more control than I once believed. So let me ask you this. Are people really the ones taking your peace away? Or are you the one giving it to them without even noticing? Most people go through life believing that the world is responsible for how they feel. They say things like, "He made me angry," "She ruined my day," or "They pushed me too far." And for a long time, I believed that too. It felt natural to blame what was happening outside of me for what I was experiencing inside. But the more I observed my own reactions, the more I started to question that assumption. If the world truly controlled our emotions, then everyone would react the same way to the same situation. But that is clearly not the case. One person gets insulted and immediately becomes furious. Another hears the same words and simply walks away, untouched. The event is identical, yet the experience is completely different. And that difference reveals something important. It is not the event itself that disturbs us. It is the meaning we assign to it. I remember a moment that made this painfully clear to me. Someone criticized me in a way that felt personal, not aggressive, but sharp enough to trigger something inside me. And I carried that feeling for hours, replaying the moment again and again, trying to justify why I felt the way I did. At first I told myself it was because they were wrong or disrespectful, but as I sat with it longer, I realized the discomfort was not coming from their words. It was coming from my interpretation of them. A part of me felt judged. A part of me felt exposed. And instead of seeing that clearly, I chose to react to it. And in that reaction, I lost control. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that I did not fully understand until much later. He reminded himself that he had power over his mind, not over external events. And when I first read that, it sounded simple, almost obvious. But living it is something else entirely, because it requires you to take responsibility in a way that is uncomfortable. It means you can no longer say that someone else made you feel something. It means you have to admit that you participated in creating that feeling. This is where most people resist, because it feels easier to believe that the problem is out there. It protects the ego. It allows you to stay in the role of someone who has been wronged. But it also keeps you trapped, because if other people control your emotions, then you will always be at their mercy. Your peace will depend on how they behave, how they speak, and how they treat you. And that is a fragile way to live. There is another way to see it, and it changes everything. Imagine that your mind is not a passive receiver of events, but an active interpreter. Everything that happens passes through your judgment first, before it becomes an emotion, before it becomes anger, frustration, or hurt. There is always a moment, even if it is small, where you decide what this means to you. Most of the time, you do it unconsciously, so it feels automatic. But it is still a choice. When someone disrespects you, you can see it as an attack on your worth, or you can see it as a reflection of their state of mind. When something does not go your way, You can see it as unfair and frustrating, or you can see it as part of the natural flow of life. The situation does not change, but your experience of it does, and that is where your power lies. I began to notice that the more I practiced this awareness, the less reactive I became. Not because people suddenly changed, but because I stopped giving their actions the same meaning. I stopped assuming that everything was about me. I stopped interpreting every inconvenience as something personal, and slowly, something shifted. The same situations that used to disturb me started to lose their intensity. Not completely, but enough for me to see clearly. This does not mean you will never feel anger again. It does not mean you become indifferent or numb. What it means is that you start to see the process behind your emotions. You begin to notice the moment where judgment turns into feeling, and once you see that moment, you can intervene. You can choose differently. And that is the beginning of freedom. The truth is simple, but it takes time to accept. You are not disturbed by what happens. You are disturbed by how you interpret what happens. And once you truly understand this, not just intellectually, but through your own experience, you stop being a victim of circumstances, and you begin to take responsibility for your inner world. And that responsibility, as heavy as it may feel at first, is also the source of your strength. Most of the suffering people experience does not come from what happens to them, but from how quickly they react to it. The speed of their reaction often becomes the source of their regret. There is a pattern that repeats itself again and again. Something happens. A word is spoken. A situation unfolds. And almost instantly, the mind jumps in to respond. There is no space, no reflection, only impulse. And that impulse, more often than not, is driven by emotion rather than clarity. I used to believe that reacting quickly meant being strong, that having an immediate response was a sign of confidence. But over time, I began to notice something different. The faster I reacted, the less control I actually had. There was a moment that made this very clear to me. I was in a conversation where someone questioned my work in front of others. It was not aggressive, but it carried a tone that felt dismissive, and I could feel the reaction rising inside me. My chest tightened, my thoughts rushed, and I was ready to respond, to defend myself, to correct them, to restore my sense of control. But something in me paused, not for long, just a few seconds, but enough to interrupt the automatic pattern. In that brief silence, I saw something I had never noticed before. The urge to react was not coming from strength. It was coming from insecurity. It was my need to protect my image, not my need to seek truth. That small pause changed everything. Instead of reacting immediately, I chose to wait, to observe. And in doing so, the intensity of the emotion began to fade. Not completely, but enough for me to see clearly. Enough for me to respond rather than react. This is what most people miss. The difference between reacting and responding is not in what you say. It is in the state of mind you bring to the moment. And that state of mind is shaped by whether or not you create space before you act. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself not to be carried away by impressions. He understood that the first thought that enters your mind is not always the truth. It is only a suggestion, a possibility, something that appears quickly and demands your attention. But you do not have to accept it immediately. When someone disrespects you, the first impression might be that you are being attacked, that you need to defend yourself. But if you pause, even briefly, you might see something else. You might see that their behavior has more to do with them than with you, or that the situation is not as serious as it first appeared. The problem is that most people never give themselves that chance. They move from stimulus to reaction without interruption, like a reflex. And because it happens so quickly, they believe it is unavoidable. But it is not. There is always a gap, even if it is small. And within that gap lies your power. It is not a dramatic moment. It is not something that feels extraordinary. It is quiet, almost invisible. But it is there, waiting to be used. I started practicing this in small ways, not in extreme situations, but in everyday moments. When someone interrupted me, when something did not go as planned, when I felt that familiar rise of irritation, instead of following it, I paused, I took a breath, and I reminded myself that I did not need to react right away. At first, it felt unnatural, almost forced, as if I was holding something back. But over time, it became easier. The pause became more natural, and the reactions became less intense. What I discovered is that emotions are like waves. They rise quickly, but they also pass. If you do not act on them immediately, they begin to lose their force. And in that space, clarity emerges. You start to see the situation more objectively. You start to understand what actually matters. And more importantly, what does not. This is not about suppressing your emotions or pretending they do not exist. It is about giving yourself enough space to not be controlled by them. The discipline of the pause is not something you master overnight. It is something you practice, moment by moment, day by day. And each time you succeed, even in a small way, you strengthen your ability to remain calm under pressure. You begin to trust that you do not need to react instantly to prove anything. You begin to see that real strength is quiet. It does not rush. It does not demand attention. It simply remains steady. In the end, the pose is not just a technique. It is a shift in how you relate to your own mind. Instead of being carried away by every thought and emotion, you begin to observe them, to question them, and to choose how you respond. And in that choice, you find something that most people are still searching for. A sense of control that does not depend on the world being different, but on you being present enough to not lose yourself in the moment. Most of the pain we feel in our interactions with others comes from a simple but powerful misunderstanding. We assume that what people say and do is about us. We take their words as judgments of our worth, their actions as reflections of who we are. And in doing so, we place ourselves at the center of every situation. For a long time, I did the same. If someone spoke to me with irritation, I believed I had done something wrong. If someone dismissed my opinion, I felt diminished. And if someone acted cold or distant, I questioned my value. But over time, I began to notice something that changed the way I saw people entirely. People do not act based on who you are. They act based on who they are. Their behavior is shaped by their thoughts, their fears, their past experiences, and their current state of mind, and most of the time, it has very little to do with you. When someone is impatient, it often reflects the pressure they are carrying. When someone is critical, it may reveal their own dissatisfaction. And when someone is rude or dismissive, it can be a sign of inner conflict rather than a deliberate attack. I remember a moment that made this clear to me. I was speaking with someone who responded in a way that felt unnecessarily harsh. My first instinct was to take it personally, to assume that they were disrespecting me, and I could feel the familiar rise of irritation. But instead of reacting, I paused and looked more closely, not at what they said, but at how they said it, their tone, their tension, their lack of presence, and it became obvious that something else was going on, something unrelated to me. In that moment, I realized that I had a choice. I could interpret their behavior as an attack and respond with defensive or I could see it as a reflection of their internal state and remain calm. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that when people act wrongly, it is because they do not understand what is right, not because they are deliberately trying to harm you. This perspective does not excuse their behavior, but it changes how you respond to it. Instead of feeling offended, you begin to feel a sense of distance, even a quiet form of understanding. It is similar to encountering someone who is lost or confused. You do not take their actions personally. You simply recognize that they are acting from a place of limitation. The difficulty is that our minds are quick to create meaning, especially when something feels uncomfortable. We interpret tone, words, and actions through our own insecurities, and without realizing it, we build a story that places us at the center of the conflict. Someone ignores you, and you think you are being rejected. Someone disagrees with you, and you feel attacked. Someone is distant, and you assume you are not valued. But these interpretations are not facts. They are assumptions, and most of the time, they are inaccurate. I began to test this in my own life. Whenever I felt the urge to take something personally, I would ask myself a simple question: what if this has nothing to do with me? At first, it felt unnatural, almost like I was dismissing my own experience. But the more I practiced it, the more I saw how often it was true. Situations that once felt heavy and personal started to lose their intensity, not because people changed, but because I stopped interpreting everything as a reflection of myself. This does not mean you ignore all feedback or pretend that nothing affects you. There are moments when people do speak directly about you, when their words carry truth or intention, but even then, you still have a choice. You can examine what is useful and let go of what is not, without attaching your identity to it. You are not defined by every opinion you encounter, and you do not need to react to every expression directed toward you. There is a certain freedom that comes when you stop making everything about yourself. You move through the world with less tension, less defensiveness, and more clarity. You begin to see people as they are, not as reflections of your own fears or insecurities. Their anger no longer provokes you in the same way. Their criticism does not penetrate as deeply, and their behavior loses the power it once had over your emotional state. In the end, understanding that people reveal themselves, not you, is not just a comforting idea. It is a practical way to protect your peace. It allows you to step back from unnecessary conflict and remain grounded in your own perspective. When you truly see this, you stop reacting to every movement around you, and instead, you become steady, observing without being pulled in, responding only when it is necessary, and remaining untouched when it is not. Anger often feels powerful in the moment. It gives you a sense of certainty, a sense that you are right and that something must be done. But if you observe it closely, you begin to see that it is not power. It is weight. It is something you carry, sometimes long after the moment has passed, long after the person who triggered it has moved on. And the longer you hold it, the heavier it becomes. I used to think that holding on to anger meant I was standing my ground, that I was not letting things slide. But in reality, I was only holding on to something that was slowly draining me. There was a time when someone said something that stayed with me far longer than it should have. It was not even a major conflict, just a moment of disrespect. But I replayed it again and again in my mind. I imagined what I should have said, how I should have responded. And each time I revisited it, the feeling grew stronger, not weaker. The strange part was that the situation itself was over. It existed only in my memory, yet it continued to affect me as if it was still happening. That was the moment I began to understand that anger does not need a present event to survive. It only needs your attention. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the best way to avenge yourself is not to become like the one who wronged you. And when I first read that, I thought it was about morality, about being better than others. But over time, I realized it was something deeper. It was about not allowing another person's actions to reshape your inner state. When you hold on to anger, you are not punishing them. You are allowing their behavior to continue influencing you, even in their absence. You are extending the life of the event far beyond its original moment. Anger has a way of convincing you that it is justified. And sometimes it is. Sometimes people do act unfairly. They say things they should not say. They behave in ways that are careless or harmful. And it is natural to feel a reaction. But the problem is not the initial feeling. The problem is what you do with it afterward. If you choose to hold on to it, to revisit it, to keep it alive in your thoughts, then it becomes a burden you are actively carrying, not something that was forced upon you. I began to notice how often I was choosing to carry that burden, not consciously, but through habit, through the repeated act of thinking about what had happened. Each time I returned to the memory, I was picking it up again, adding more weight to it. It was like carrying a heavy object from one place to another, except there was no destination, no purpose, only the act of carrying itself. And the longer I held it, the more it affected everything else. My mood, my focus, my ability to be present. Letting go did not come naturally at first. It felt like I was giving up something important, like I was allowing the other person to get away with what they had done. But that was another illusion. Holding on to anger does not correct the past. It does not change what happened. It only changes your present experience. When I began to see it this way, letting go started to feel less like a loss and more like a release. There is a moment, if you pay attention, when you realize that you are holding on to something you no longer need. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost subtle, but it is there. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can continue carrying it, or you can put it down. The act of letting go is not about forgetting or pretending that nothing happened. It is about deciding that this moment, right now, matters more than something that no longer exists. I started practicing this in small ways. When I noticed myself replaying a situation, I would pause and ask, is this helping me? Is this worth my energy? And most of the time, the answer was no. That question alone created enough distance for me to step back, to stop feeding the emotion, and slowly, it would begin to fade. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to give me back a sense of control. In the end, anger is not something that remains on its own. It requires your participation, your attention, your willingness to carry it forward. And once you see that clearly, you realize that you have more power than you thought. You cannot always control what happens, but you can decide how long you will carry it. And in that decision, you determine whether the event ends when it happens, or continues long after it is over. Anger often appears simple on the surface. It feels direct, immediate, and justified. But when you look more closely, you begin to see that it is rarely the true emotion. It is usually a mask, something that covers a deeper and more uncomfortable feeling that you would rather not face. For a long time, I believed that when I felt angry, it was because something outside of me had gone wrong. Someone had crossed a line, a situation had been unfair, or something had not gone the way I expected. But the more I paid attention, the more I started to notice a pattern. Anger was not the beginning of the emotion. It was the result of something else underneath. I remember a moment when a friend cancelled plans with me at the last minute, and my immediate reaction was irritation. I told myself that it was disrespectful, that they should have valued my time more, and I carried that frustration with me for hours. But when I stopped and looked at it honestly, without trying to justify my reaction, I realized something different. I was not really angry about the cancellation itself. I was hurt. I felt unimportant. I had been looking forward to that time, and when it did not happen, it triggered something deeper than the surface emotion I was showing. That realization was uncomfortable, because it required me to admit that my reaction was not as simple as I thought. It was not just about what happened. It was about how I felt about myself in that moment. Anger had been easier to hold on to because it felt strong. It felt like I was standing my ground. But the truth underneath it was more vulnerable, and facing that vulnerability required honesty, not with anyone else, but with myself. Marcus Aurelius often wrote to himself about the importance of seeing things clearly, not as he wished them to be, but as they were. And this applies not only to the world around you, but to your inner world as well. When you refuse to look honestly at your own emotions, you remain trapped in them, because you never understand what is actually driving them. But when you begin to observe yourself without judgment, without the need to defend your reactions, something changes. The intensity of the emotion begins to lose its hold on you. Most people never go beyond the surface. They feel anger and stop there. They react, they justify, and they move on without ever questioning what was underneath. And because of that, the same patterns repeat themselves. The same triggers produce the same reactions, and nothing really changes. But when you take the time to look deeper, you begin to see that many of your reactions are connected to old patterns, past experiences, or unexamined beliefs about yourself. I began to ask myself simple questions in moments of discomfort, not to analyze everything in a complicated way, but to create a moment of clarity. What am I actually feeling right now? What is beneath this reaction? And sometimes the answers were not what I expected. Sometimes it was insecurity. Sometimes it was disappointment. Sometimes it was a fear of being misunderstood or not valued. And once I saw that, the anger no longer felt as solid as it did before. There is a certain power in naming your true emotion. When you move from saying, "I am angry," to saying, "I feel hurt," or "I feel overlooked," or "I feel uncertain," you shift from reaction to awareness. And that awareness creates space. It allows you to respond in a way that is more aligned with reality rather than impulse. Instead of reacting aggressively, you can communicate clearly, or sometimes you realize that nothing needs to be said at all. This does not mean that every situation requires deep analysis, and it does not mean you should overthink every feeling. But it does mean that when something affects you strongly, it is worth taking a moment to understand why, not to judge yourself, not to criticize your reaction, but to see it for what it is. Because clarity is what gives you the ability to change. Over time, this practice becomes more natural. You start to recognize your emotional patterns more quickly. You see the connection between your thoughts and your reactions, and you become less controlled by them. The same situations may still arise. People may still behave in ways that challenge you, but your response begins to change. Not because the world is different, but because you are more aware of what is happening within you. In the end, looking honestly at yourself is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming aware. It is about seeing the truth of your own experience without distortion. And once you can do that, you are no longer at the mercy of emotions you do not understand. You begin to move through life with a sense of clarity and steadiness that comes not from controlling everything around you, but from understanding what is happening inside you. Many people believe that staying calm means accepting everything, that if you are not reacting with anger, you must tolerate whatever comes your way. But this is not clarity. It is confusion. For a long time, I thought that being patient meant staying silent, that avoiding conflict was a sign of strength. So I allowed certain behaviors to repeat, small things at first. Interruption, dismissive comments, a lack of respect for my time. And each time, I said nothing. I told myself it was not important, that it was better to stay peaceful. But what I did not realize was that silence without awareness does not create peace. It creates pressure. Over time, that pressure builds, not on the outside, but within you. You begin to feel a quiet frustration, something that does not show immediately, but grows slowly, and eventually, it finds a way out, often in a moment that seems unrelated, a small trigger, a minor inconvenience, and suddenly, the reaction is stronger than it should be, not because of the moment itself, but because of everything that has been left unspoken. I began to see that what I thought was patience was actually avoidance, and what I avoided eventually turned into resentment. Marcus Aurelius did not teach passive acceptance. He taught alignment with reason, and part of that alignment is knowing what you allow and what you do not. You cannot control how others behave, but you are always responsible for what you accept. And if you do not define that clearly, people will not know your limits. Not because they are careless, but because you have never shown them where those limits are. I remember a situation where someone consistently spoke over me during conversations. Each time it happened, I felt a small irritation, but I ignored it. I told myself it was not worth addressing, but after a while, that irritation did not stay small. It grew, and it began to affect how I saw that person, not because of one action, but because of repetition without clarity. Eventually, I realized that the situation was not changing because I had never made it clear that it needed to. When I finally addressed it, I did not raise my voice. I did not express frustration. I simply stated what I needed. I said that I preferred to finish my thoughts before being interrupted, and I did it calmly, without accusation, without emotion attached to it. And something shifted, not dramatically, but enough. The pattern began to change, and more importantly, I felt a sense of relief, not because the other person changed immediately, but because I had stopped ignoring what mattered to me. Defining your limits does not require anger. It requires clarity. It is not about controlling others. It is about expressing what you are willing to accept and what you are not, and doing so without hostility. Many people avoid setting boundaries because they fear conflict, they fear rejection, or they believe it will make them appear difficult. But the truth is, unclear boundaries create more conflict in the long run, because they allow frustration to build in silence. There is a difference between reacting emotionally and responding with intention. When you set a boundary from a place of anger, it often leads to resistance. But when you set it from a place of calm understanding, it carries a different weight. It is not about proving a point. It is about maintaining your own balance. You do not need to explain yourself excessively. You do not need to justify your needs. You only need to be clear and consistent. I began to practice this in small ways, not by confronting everything at once, but by noticing what affected me and choosing to address it when necessary. Sometimes it was as simple as asking for space. Sometimes it was declining a request. And sometimes it was choosing not to engage at all. Each time, it felt uncomfortable at first, but over time, that discomfort faded, and what remained was a stronger sense of self-respect. One of the most important things I learned is that setting boundaries is not about changing others. It is about changing your relationship with yourself. It is about recognizing that your time, your energy, and your attention have value, and that protecting them is not selfish. It is necessary. When you stop expecting others to automatically understand your limits and begin to define them yourself, you remove a large source of frustration from your life. In the end, calmness is not the absence of limits. It is the result of having them clearly defined. You do not need to react to every situation, but you also do not need to accept everything. There is a balance between the two, and finding that balance is what allows you to remain steady without becoming passive, to stay peaceful without losing your sense of direction. A calm mind is often mistaken for something natural, something that some people are simply born with, while others are not. But if you observe closely, you begin to see that calmness is not a personality trait. It is a discipline, something that is built over time through repeated choices, small moments of awareness, and consistent practice. For a long time, I believed that one day I would reach a point where nothing would disturb me, where I would finally feel completely in control. But that expectation itself became a source of frustration, because the reality is different. Calmness is not a permanent state. It is something you return to. Again and again, there are still moments when I feel irritation, when something does not go as planned, when someone says something that triggers a reaction, and in those moments, the old patterns are still there. The impulse to react, to judge, to take things personally. But the difference now is not that those impulses disappear. It is that I notice them sooner. And in noticing, I create space. That space is where everything begins to change. Because without awareness, there is no choice. And without choice, there is no control. Marcus Aurelius did not become calm by escaping difficulty. He lived in the middle of it, surrounded by pressure, responsibility, and constant uncertainty. Yet he trained his mind to return to clarity, not by avoiding the world, but by adjusting how he saw it. He reminded himself daily that external events are not the problem, but our judgments about them. And that reminder was not something he read once and mastered. It was something he practiced repeatedly, because the mind does not change through understanding alone. It changes through repetition. I began to see this in my own life. The moments when I felt most at peace were not random. They were connected to what I had been doing consistently, when I paid attention to my thoughts, when I questioned my reactions, when I chose to pause instead of respond. Those moments accumulated, and over time, they reshaped how I experienced situations that used to disturb me. It was not a sudden transformation. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. But the effects became clear when I found myself in situations that would have triggered me before, and realized that the intensity was no longer the same. Training the mind is not about forcing it into silence. It is about guiding it, gently but consistently, back to clarity. One way I practiced this was by shifting my focus when something went wrong. Instead of replaying the problem, I asked what could be done next. When I felt frustration, I reminded myself of what was still within my control. And when I caught myself dwelling on something unnecessary, I redirected my attention, not perfectly, but enough to break the pattern. Another part of this training is what you allow into your mind. The content you consume, the conversations you engage in, and the environment you spend time in all shape your internal state. If you surround yourself with negativity, constant complaint, and reactive thinking, it becomes much harder to remain calm. Not because you lack discipline, but because you are feeding the very patterns you are trying to change. I began to notice that when I limited unnecessary noise and chose more intentional input, my mind felt less crowded, less reactive, and more stable. There is also something important about consistency, not intensity. Many people try to change everything at once. They want immediate results. But the mind does not respond well to force. It responds to repetition. Small actions done consistently are far more effective than occasional efforts that are quickly abandoned. It is not about having one perfect day. It is about returning to the practice, even after you lose it, even after you react, even after you forget, because each return strengthens the habit. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. You start to trust your ability to handle situations without being overwhelmed. You realize that calmness is not fragile. It does not disappear at the first sign of difficulty. It becomes something you can access. Not because the world has become easier, but because you have become more stable within it. The same events still occur. People still behave unpredictably. Situations still change without warning. But your relationship with those events is no longer the same. In the end, a calm mind is not something you find. It is something you build, moment by moment, choice by choice. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Not effortless, but familiar. You stop searching for a life without disturbance. And instead, you develop the ability to remain steady within it. And that shift, more than anything else, is what creates a sense of peace that does not depend on circumstances, but on your ability to return to yourself. No matter what happens around you,